Welcome to a special Navigating Net Zero mini-series. Navigating Net Zero in Focus, Developments in Climate Standards and Guidance. In this mini-series, your host Alexia Kelly sits down with the leadership of many of the foremost climate accounting and reporting bodies to get the latest on this fast-moving, sometimes confusing space. Together, they get to the bottom of what each of these standards does, what they're doing to rise to the moment, and why it's so important to get all of this right. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive right in.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Navigating Net Zero, the podcast where we talk about what's working, what's not, and what's next. I am Alexia Kelly, your host, and I am absolutely delighted to be joined here today by the inaugural CEO of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Tim Mohin, who I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the last few months, but really exceptionally excited to have this conversation with you here today, Tim, and welcome to the pod.
Thank you so much, Alexia. I am excited too. It's been a great pleasure to get to know you over the last few months. You are a deep well of information and relationships that go many years into this field. And so I feel like I could learn as much from you as you could learn from me in this discussion. And I'm super excited to jump right in.
Well, very kind of you. And just by quick way of introduction, Tim, as I noted, is the first CEO of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but he is not new to standardization or standard setting. Tim brings decades of global leadership, combining standard setting, executive leadership, and environmental expertise across the public and private sectors. He previously served as CEO of the Global Reporting Initiative from 2017 until 2020, and we'll talk a little bit about that today, and has held senior sustainability leadership roles at major technology companies, including Intel, Apple, and AMD. He also served as Executive Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer for ESG software company Persephone, and earlier in his career, he worked at the U.S. EPA and in the U.S. Senate, developing deep experience in policy regulation and government engagement on environmental and sustainability issues. Immediately prior to joining the GHG, Tim was a partner and director of climate and sustainability at Boston Consulting Group, and he got his start working on environmental policy at the EPA in the U.S. Senate. And you are also a book author, Changing Business from the Inside Out, as well as the newsletter Sustainability Simplified.
It comes out every Friday on Substack and LinkedIn,
which I have been a loyal reader for a very long time. I knew you through that prior to meeting you, and it's just so helpful and such an important contribution to tracking this really interesting, momentous, and a little bit crazy time we find ourselves in the global standard setting space. So Tim, tell us a little bit about your history and how you came to joining the GHG as their first CEO.
Well, first of all, thank you for that kind introduction. When I think back on, it's actually 4 decades and counting of working in one field. I'm one of the weirdos that never changed profession. I certainly changed jobs, but I've never changed profession. And the reason for that is my profession is my passion. It is my cause. When I go to work, it's what I want to do. I want to basically save the environment, work for environmental social justice across the world. And it's something that has always been part of me. So, I'm one of those people that's sort of inwardly motivated to do the work that we do. It is manifested in many different ways, as your introduction would have suggested. When I first started, I am an old guy, so it was many, many years ago. We didn't have the word sustainability, right? And so if you wanted to do the things that I just mentioned, really you had 2 choices. You could be an environmental activist working for an NGO, a pressure group, or you could go work at the government. Companies weren't to be trusted, they were to be regulated. And so I went to work for the government, and I was an air toxics regulator. That led me up to Capitol Hill, clean air, clean water, super fun, some of the biggest environmental legislative packages of our time. I often say I was like the Forrest Gump of environmental regulation. I just showed up at the right place at the right time and was privileged enough to be part of a lot of those policy developments that are still very much the foundational bedrock with us today. But something changed along the way. We sort of went from command and control regulation to voluntary disclosure, voluntary action. This is when the Global Reporting Initiative started to come onto the scene and said, look, what are these companies doing? We need to know more. And that began this whole sort of corporate social responsibility movement. And that's when I kind of made the shift as well. I saw government working less efficiently, and I think that has just gotten worse, not better, unfortunately. But companies actually moving faster than regulators in terms of environmental protection. I wanted to be part of that. So that's what led me to 20 plus years in primarily the tech sector, as you mentioned, and lots of different accomplishments there. Continue to have great relationships across the board. But one of the threads that held it all together was this issue of disclosure. When we think about all the things that companies are doing voluntarily, they have to tell that story. And so that's what led me to go to run GRI and to get involved with standards. Because standards, and I've said this to you before, it's a social construct. It's what we all choose to do the same way across the world. That's fascinating to me because as a former regulator, we could only regulate in one jurisdiction, whereas standards are truly global. It is that social construct that spans the entire world and says, this is how we're going to count greenhouse gas emissions. This is how we're going to report them. And that, to me, was a real unlock in terms of the leverage that that brings along with it. That was my interest in standards. That's what led me to go to GRI and has led me to my current position at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol.
That's great. And tell us a little bit about your time at GRI, what it did, why it was important at the time, and what you learned about standards development that are globally applicable from that experience.
Yeah, great question. When I think about my time at GRI, it was already a somewhat mature organization, but was still growing very quickly. We were like 110 people working out of Amsterdam. Again, the G stands for global. So it was born in the US, but we wanted it to be based in Europe to kind of make that point. And when I think about and reflect upon that experience, what most people don't understand about standards is it's a very wonky technical process that without the governance within that organization, then the standards don't matter. Again, going back to that sort of social construct or social contract, it really demands that you have folks from across the various demographics, that is sector, that is region, all coming together with the same expertise to really opine upon what is the right way to measure, what is the right way to report, so that we can have comparability. And when we have comparability, then we can make decisions about how to protect the environment. That's how standards are made. And GRI was one of the pioneers in doing this. And then over time, they saw that they had to put these governance modules in place. And that's where I came into the organization. And then by the time I left the organization, we had what was called the quote alphabet soup. And I think we're very much still in that era. When you have a lot of different standard setters and a lot of different standards, it's just confusing. And frankly, it works against our very purpose, our mission. And so my tenure at GRI was to try to harmonize, to try and converge the standards together. I was quite proud of the work we did to actually bring several standard setters together, and that led to the creation of the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, about 5 years ago. That was constructed at a meeting in Davos 2020 that I was there. I've got a selfie from everybody that was there. And still to this day, I think there's a lot more work we could do to bring folks together to get a single common global measurement system. And that's what I hope to accomplish here at GHGP as well.
Yeah, it's a great segue to GHGP. I always chuckle a little bit as somebody who has worked not as long as you, but a long time in this space, that the greenhouse gas accounting kind of conversation used to be a few experts in a room at the UN and in a few nonprofits, having very intense and passionate, very academic conversations about how you do this accounting and what the right ways and methods are. And it's evolved significantly, which I think is both a sign of our progress, but also a sign that it's time for us to really start thinking about how these rules impact and direct real world action and financial flows. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about just the role that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol itself plays. What are its core functions? What does it do for us that other standards don't do? Why is it so important? And from there, we can dig into some of the wonkier bits that I'm excited to chat with you about as well.
I mean, first of all, this is the greatest story never told. This is the unsung heroes of the climate movement. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants that came before me who created the first measurement system for greenhouse gases 25 years ago. And, that wasn't even a thing before. But as I think most of your listeners know, greenhouse gases are rarely measured and they're often estimated. And so, how do we estimate the amount of greenhouse gas emissions from various corporate activities, various project activities, cities, et cetera? That's what the GHGP, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, took on 25 years ago. And they developed a framework, as we all know and love, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. I don't think we even need to define those for your listeners. They've become sort of the standard building blocks of greenhouse gas accounting. This is the infrastructure. This is what the entire world uses to measure their emissions. And measuring the emissions is the first step in reducing those emissions. And I can say with firsthand knowledge, the companies I work for are reducing their emissions. They're doing so voluntarily, and they're using the GHGP to measure where they are today and how they're progressing towards the net zero goals that they have set for themselves. So it does work. Now, having said all that, there's a massive change in the wind, and we know that. This movement has largely been voluntary on the part of companies. And now we're seeing a movement towards mandatory disclosure. Why? Because investors care. Investors know that there are significant risks associated with the companies they invest in from climate change. They want to know what are companies doing about it in terms of reducing their own emissions and preparing for the effects of climate change. So climate risk, climate emissions are now starting to show up in capital market regulations around the world.
Yeah, and that piece, I think, is so important because this is maybe one of the most consequential, to your point, sort of, set of unsung heroes who have been doing the hard, just emotional and, well, sometimes emotional, but intellectual labor of just figuring out, like, in this system where everything is mostly estimated and not directly measured, which I think is such an important point and is actually often overlooked in these conversations. Like, we really need to think about how do you standardize these and how do we build in continuous improvement so that as the science gets better, as our understanding of what's happening and our understanding and ability to measure and estimate these emissions through new tools, resources, technologies gets better and better, how do we continuously evolve, but in a way that is predictable and manageable so that companies can deploy the capital we need them to be deploying into decarbonization technologies for their supply chains and into, in our view, the full suite of additional mitigation actions and outcomes wherever they may be in the world that we know can make a meaningful contribution to addressing the climate crisis. And so this question of what is the right governance structure for that role, I think, is a really, really important one. And I'm curious if you can just elaborate a little bit in your mind, what does a really good, well-functioning global regulator look like in your view? And I know you had been advising in your previous role, the GHGP team, on the kind of new governance structure. So maybe just talk through a little bit of like what that looks like now and where you see that going in the future.
I think you need to look no further than the group I mentioned before, the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. In terms of the overall infrastructure, it's a professional, paid staff, paid board members. They have a definitive process for considering inputs, and they go through this process and issue standards that are then adopted by just about every country in the world when it comes to financial standards. Now, the sustainability standards, the climate standards they're working on are following that same path, but it's nascent, it's new, and it's something they're still kind of working out. GHGP has a partnership with ISSB, and we are modeling a lot of our new governance processes after the ISSB. And so, that's kind of the archetype, if you will. And again, the adoption speaks louder than words. Standards work when they're adopted globally, and that's certainly what they have over there.
Yeah, that's great. And so and maybe just for folks who are not as familiar with the disclosure and kind of financial accounting landscape, maybe say just two more words about the role that ISB plays in the ecosystem right now and how you see that being complementary to or integrated with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's role.
Sure. I mean, if you take a giant step back, it's really new. But the IFRS, the International Financial Reporting System, is not. It's been around for a few decades. And why do we have a international financial reporting system? We have it because we have global trade. Globalization is a part of our life. And we couldn't really trade globally if we had different ways of accounting for money. And so we had to have an international system. The only real holdout from that is the US, which has its own system called FASB, but it's actually quite close to the international system. So it's doable. Now, the same idea was now applied to ESG, environmental, social, and governance, with the advent of the International Sustainability Standards Board, which was added on quite recently, as I said. They've issued 2 standards. One is on general ESG matters, but the one that is probably more important for your listeners is their second standard, which is on climate disclosure. We formed a partnership because they don't do the accounting side, they do the disclosure side, and GHG does the accounting side, and that's why the partnership exists. And we've been in constant contact certainly since I've joined. I was on I was on email with them earlier today about how our standards fit together in terms of both the content, the timing, and some of the cross-cutting issues. And so that's working. It's working incredibly well. And if you follow that sort of evolution that I just laid out, because there is global adoption for the financial standards in IFRS, we're going to see the same global adoption for the sustainability standards. They're up to about 40 jurisdictions that have adopted them right now, and we see that only growing over time.
And there's, what is it? What did you say? 70 jurisdictions that are now pointing specifically to the greenhouse gas protocol and their regulation?
Yeah, so you're going to ask me where the other 30 come from. Right now in the sustainability world, there's a bit of a split. So you have the International Sustainability Standards Board over here, and then you have the Europeans. The Europeans have done something a bit different. They did have a multi-stakeholder process. They did include impact in their standard setting, and so that's the main difference. But because of that difference, which may be less of a difference than people think, those are the other 29 jurisdictions, is the 29 European nations under the European Union. And they also reference the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as the accounting procedure. Now, the one left over to make it to 70 is the state of California. The state of California specifically lists the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as the required disclosure, required accounting standard for their disclosure laws that went through just a year ago. And so all told, I mean, if you look at California alone, it's the 4th largest economy in the world. But if you add up all 70, it's pretty clear the majority of global GDP relies upon the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standards.
One, I think, commonly overlooked piece of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol sort of suite of standards, right? Because it's not just one standard. You have the corporate protocol, which does what you were talking about, which is enable companies to measure their greenhouse gas footprint and really understand what their emissions impact is across their operations and supply chains. I was at WRI in 2010 during a lot of those early conversations. And the idea really was, how can we cast kind of the widest net of responsibility, and that adage of, you can't manage what you don't measure. And so we want to measure as much as possible, because that visibility enables you to then start thinking about and articulating strategies for how you manage those emissions. And that theory of change, I think, underpins a lot of that sort of broader brush that we've used to determine responsibility from an emissions footprinting perspective using the current greenhouse gas protocol. Do you think that's still the right approach? And as we continue down this path of really trying to mobilize and accelerate companies to take the most ambitious action they can, how do we balance that with some of the folks who are coming in saying, oh, we can't do that for all sorts of reasons, right? Scope 3 is just, it's too hard, it's too diffuse, it's too distinct. Tell us a little bit about why it's important to have Scope 3 in the mix.
The answer to your question is yes, and it is really important to continue with all of the different reporting and reduction efforts that have been built on the GHG Foundation over the years, including the Science-Based Targets Initiative and you name it. It's all based on the Scope 1, 2, and 3 paradigm that GHG has espoused for corporates over 25 years. But the and part is equally important, because what we're seeing on the landscape is more product corporate footprinting, or product carbon footprinting, I should say. And why is that important? It's important because not only should we know how much carbon was emitted in the creation of this product that I'm buying, so we can buy the right products, but also jurisdictions are starting to tax products based on the carbon intensity it took to make that product. And this is where I think really we're going to unlock decarbonization at speed and scale. These are called carbon border adjustment mechanisms, my favorite abbreviation or acronym CBAM. And so we're seeing these now proliferate across the world. Europe has one, UK, Australia, New Zealand. There's many different countries that are considering them. And they're all countries that have an emissions trading system. So imagine you're sort of going through the European emission trading system and you're a compliant company and you're doing the right things and decarbonizing. And then you get some imports of the same product you're making that are made in really high carbon conditions and saying, well, that's not fair. I did my part. And so that's why we're seeing these carbon tariffs pop up. This is something the Greenhouse Gas Protocol recognized, and it's the reason that GHGP partnered with the world's largest standard setter, the International Standards Organization, or ISO, to develop an international standard for product carbon footprinting. That's underway right now. It's very exciting. We are working with several multinational institutions, UN, WTO, OECD, et cetera. And this is just now starting to take shape.
That's really exciting. And I remember as well the UN FCCC mandate coming out of the COP30 presidency to GHGP and ISO to help lead a global harmonization of greenhouse gas accounting through the 2028 global stocktake. So presumably this ISO GHGP partnership on product level accounting is a piece of that. Are there other pieces that you are working on to help fulfill and deliver that mandate to the UN?
I mean, that is the biggest piece. So you're right. And it's something that we were discussing actually just today, starting with New York Climate Week, but also going into the COP process right after that. And, things never move as fast as I would like them to. And so I would have preferred to say it's all done. But right now we're still in the process of developing some of those agreements.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, that's particularly true of both GHGP and ISO, right, which have fairly large governance structures and complicated stakeholder management systems and processes. So maybe just talk a little bit about what that harmonization and convergence is looking like. So as the new CEO, what are the things you're doing to really make sure that we have the right mix of voices around the table and that decisions are taken in a really clear and transparent way?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and I should address it directly. I believe that the partnership GHGP forged with ISO, I was at BCG at the time, and we were behind the scenes helping out with this, it was announced at New York Climate Week in 2025. So it's still quite new. That's just like, 8 months ago or something. I think it's an unlock because, as I mentioned, ISO is the largest standard setter. It's actually, people probably know this, it's an association of national standard setters that all come together to agree. So it really has adoption across the world. 177 nations, and there's only 195 of them, use ISO standards. And so that global adoption is a huge unlock. Now, how do we do it? It's pretty simple. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. There are three methods. ISO develops the standard and GHGP goes through our process to accept it, and it's co-branded. Opposite is true. GHGP develops a standard and ISO goes through their process to accept it. It's co-branded. Or we work together, as we are in the product carbon footprint example I gave earlier, to develop a standard together, which is co-branded. But going forward, all of our standards are co-branded. And that's an exciting time for us because, again, we get that global adoption that I think the market and the world is really crying out for.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the fact that ISO and GHGP have had sort of similar, largely overlapping, but slightly distinct sets of guidance on a lot of the core, kind of just foundational, what I consider the backbone of the greenhouse gas accounting and, frankly, management and measurement systems we have globally, has been a challenge, I think. So anywhere we can help facilitate that alignment around this is really what right looks like based on the best available science and information we have at the time, that's super valuable. ISO is not the fastest moving process, and neither is GHGP. So what are the things you're doing to help accelerate and move expeditiously towards resolution of, what has become, I would say, a standards situation that's really impeding private capital flow and decarbonization mobilization?
We need to move faster. I mean, we're living in 2026 right now. We're living in the world of AI. Things need to move faster. As I have only been in this post less than 2 months, the first thing I'm doing is trying to raise money for the organization.
Mm-hmm.
We are doing 6 different standards revisions right now with a staff of 35 people. And obviously not all 35 are involved with standards. So that's just not appropriate. There's just
Mhm.
we're way overstretched in terms of all of the obligations that this organization has taken on. So I'm working very hard to move quickly and in the interim, give a little bit more certainty to the market, to our clients that are using these standards about which direction we're going, because they often don't have time to wait. And the last thing I'll say, and I think this is actually one of the most important things I'll say, early in my tenure as CEO of this organization, I've reached out to the other standard setters, not just ISO, but I've mentioned the others, EFRAG, the Europeans, ISSB, we mentioned the international ones, SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative. How do we work better together? How do we work so that when GHP develops the standard, it's immediately approved and taken up by the others? And that conversation was like bringing a glass of water to a thirsty man in the desert. They were like, "Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you." And so it's been a pushing on an open door. However, I think it's easier said than done. So we're in the conversations right now. I'm really hopeful that this will be more than a talking shop, that it will result in a coherent measurement and disclosure system for the world. And so I'm really proud of that early effort. And I'm going to just maybe decrease expectations a little bit, but I'm super proud of where we're going.
That's great. And that all sounds, I mean, that alignment, convergence, harmonization is so fundamentally important so that we can build, what I think ultimately needs to be a globally interoperable set of greenhouse gas accounting systems that can talk to each other and function effectively and efficiently. I do want to come back to this question, though, of like, who's at the table in the decision-making process and how we balance that in order to really make sure that we are getting that mix of strong environmental integrity, really focusing on making sure that these systems are delivering the environmental outcomes that we need them to be for the climate, and making sure that they work in the real world. And that's, the intersection of a lot of our work. I know that's been the intersection of a lot of your work over the course of your career. It is a balancing act always. So talk a little bit just about that balancing act and how you see that kind of evolving and playing out moving forward for GCP, but then also just based on your experience historically.
Yeah, I love that question. The role of a standard setter is like the role of a referee or a marriage counselor or somebody who's trying to bring people together, right? It can be hard. And I walked into a situation recently as in this new role at GP where many of our standards revisions are polarized to the extent where it's almost irrecoverable.
Yeah.
I don't know how it got that way, but I will just say London Climate Week that just passed, we saw each other there. I rarely get spontaneous applause when I talk to folks, but in this case, I said, look, we have to stop shooting at each other. We have enough people from outside the environmental movement trying to take us down. We need to come together. And people are, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then they went back to doing what they were doing anyway. So I think it's super important that we really kind of look at that and say, okay, we may not have the perfect science. And finding that pragmatism is what standard setters do. And so I'm really actually quite eager and thrilled to take on this role. It sounds weird because you're sort of walking into a fur fight. This is exactly going all the way back to the introduction. This is exactly what I did on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I keep coming back to the governance because as a standard setter and as an international regulator, like that really is the thing. That's the framework with which you have these conversations and you negotiate these compromises. And so I think helping people understand both some of the governance changes that have been made at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And as you know, my background is in emissions trading and carbon pricing, and the evolution there from NGOs stepping into the breach where governments weren't actually or were not able to get aligned or were not willing politically or able politically to step in and regulate. These NGOs stepped up and said, okay, somebody needs to write down the rules for how this is all going to work, and we're going to do that. That was very much the birth of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol coming out of WRI and WBCSD all those 25 years ago. Similarly, in the carbon markets, right? We have, last I heard, 50 different standards bodies that are active in the carbon markets. And the ICBCM, the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, has been an example of how we've moved past this highly fractured, highly balkanized, everybody's doing it their own way, everybody's feeling the same part of the elephant and describing it slightly differently, to a much more coherent, kind of organized global threshold benchmark for what it means to be a high integrity carbon credit. And that experience and exercise, I think, is where GHGP really needs to be moved to, which is just how do you create that really credible, well-governed, highly transparent global regulator that is acting as a regulator does and not as, an activist NGO or somebody who really has an axe to grind. And so maybe talk through the governance structure that you guys have put in place, because I don't know that everybody is familiar with it, and how you're seeing that evolve over the next little bit.
First of all, your thesis is 100% right. It's spot on. But one of the reasons I took this job is it's a little more mature than people understand. Even with the cohesive model that you mentioned, the greenhouse gas protocol enjoys a 97% adoption rate across the S&P 500. We already talked about the adoption rate in different jurisdictions. It is the foundation. And so we already have that. Now it's a matter of like putting in those systems processes in governance that give us those levers of legitimacy for this new regulatory world that we're stepping into. We've already started that process, and this started before I joined, so can't take credit for everything, but this one definitely I can't take credit for. It was a process started, I think, 2.5 years ago, where we have a steering committee and we have technical working groups. The base of the pyramid is the technical working groups. These are the folks from all demographics that come together with expertise in a particular issue, be it forest carbon accounting, be it electricity, be it whatever the issue is, to develop the actual standard. That standard then goes to an independent standards board, which we have set up. And then those standards are ratified by a steering committee. Those bodies are in place and functioning quite well within the GHG today. And again, it's been based on those benchmarks of other international standard setters that do have jurisdictional reliance. And so we're actually thinking this will work quite well.
That's great news. And I agree. I think that more structured governance is a big improvement on sort of what it was before. And I think having that clear line of sight to who's making which decision when and who has ultimate kind of purview is incredibly important. I want to come back to the kind of alignment with the financial markets, because that's something you touched on earlier. And I think just thinking through, like, how do we make sure that these standards really are fit for purpose? And just underscore the point you made earlier, which is like the greenhouse gas protocol is one of the great environmental success stories of our movement, right? Like, truly. I remember, when we were first starting, like, it was controversial that companies were going to report emissions. To your point, like, we didn't even really have language for it. And so getting people to like sit down and say, okay, this is how we're going to do this really hard, complicated thing that we're still not really good at. We don't have very good data. We don't know where to get the data. We're not even sure what data we need to be looking for. That process, like, we have come a long way in the last 2 decades as a field, and really building a system that, to your point, everybody uses now, which is amazing. I mean, just to have that comparability. And there's a lot of noise right now in that, oh, well, maybe the GHGPP isn't fit for purpose, or we don't need the scopes, or they're too complicated, we can't make them work. And that feels to me personally like a huge mistake. There's this sense that, like, oh, we didn't get it exactly right the first time, so we should just like throw the baby out with the bathwater and start all over again. You probably know who I'm talking about when I say that.
Yes.
And that, I think, is really dangerous. So maybe just talk a little bit about your perspective on that evolution, and how do we make sure that we learn from and build on the lessons of the past, while recognizing that we really have made a lot of progress.
We've made a ton of progress. And I want to go back to a point you made earlier, which was a lot of this progress, really the environmental movement deserves all the credit. And the same thing for GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, we mentioned before. That was a product of the CERES organization, the Coalition for Environmentally Responsible Economies, based out of Boston, Mass. Many of your listeners probably know them. Back in the late 80s, in the Valdez spill, they were like, oh, we got to figure out what companies are doing. And that's now become, a global standard. Same with GHGP. It really started from this notion that we really need a way to measure greenhouse gas emissions. Now, fast forward on that maturity curve, the base of your question, we're not fit for purpose for the future. This was fit for purpose in a voluntary disclosure paradigm. In the future, as we go into the mandatory disclosure paradigm, there's a whole lot of other expertise that has to be brought in. I'll use an example of the big 4 accountancy firms. What these folks do is they go through each disclosure in very fine detail and understand the provenance of each piece of information in that disclosure, and does it check out? That's, the assurance process. And therefore, they can then write an assurance letter saying, we put our name on this as being true. our standards need to go through such a rigorous process to be assurable. That's one example of where we need to professionalize. Another is the work I talked about before with harmonization with the jurisdictional standard setters across the world. And that's something I also spoke to. And, those kinds of efforts are ones that I am going to bring with me because I really feel like this is our future going forward.
Yeah.
And it will change the nature of this. And I don't want to lose the massive credit that goes to the roots of the GHGP simply because now it has been successful and is moving into this new sort of regulatory world. I think if you talk to the folks like Janet Reagan-Nathan and others who gave birth to this thing 25 years ago, they would have dreamed of this world and said, yes, this is what we want. Well, now it's happening, and it doesn't take a thing away. In fact, it only underscores the incredible work that was done to create these standards.
Yeah, and I want to just especially for our listeners who are not as deep in the weeds on assurance and financial market alignment, the point you just made about third-party assurance and auditability is fundamentally important. And I didn't even really fully appreciate it until I was inside of a company working with our CFO and our CEO, trying to figure out what are we willing to sign on the dotted line, put in public documentation that we are responsible for. And how do we think about with our regulators, right, the SEC and others, the information that we're disclosing publicly and making sure that that is credible? And this issue of assurance became really, really important. It means that you need to be able to get recognized third-party assurance bodies, as you noted, to be able to come in and use our standards and go through their formal processes they are mandated by their accreditation bodies to follow and say, yep, this all lines up. This data is corrected. It conforms with our data requirements. It conforms with our transparency and disclosure requirements. All of those pieces are there. We don't have that in a lot of the standards that have been developed to date across the greenhouse gas accounting field. And so personally, I think a lot of the work that needs to happen in the next 2 to 5 years is that very deep alignment and evaluation of, okay, what's it going to take? Because in many instances, it's actually not huge. Right? It's like you're missing a disclosure requirement here. You need a specific provision to address fraud there. You need to require more data in this element of your standard. Like it's tweaks. It's not surgery.
Exactly.
Those tweaks move us from being, voluntary NGO on an ESG report that nobody really pays attention to at the corporate level to things that can start to be integrated into mainstream disclosure statements and disclosures. And that is, to your point, and I think to the broader conversation, we're in the middle of that transition right now, but that transition is fundamentally important to making sure that environmental action and markets and information is not just this siloed sideshow that a bunch of hippies are doing because they think it's important, right? It is information that is fully integrated into the mainstream economy and into the way in which businesses think about their business. And we still have a long way to go there, but that evolution, I'm so glad that you're focused on that. And I just want to underscore how important I think it is based on my experience working inside of one of these companies, because we just are not going to get where we need to go if we aren't able to integrate into the large scale private capital markets.
I mean, you said it perfectly. And just to underscore one of the points you said, this is not about more administrivia. This is not about more paperwork. The ultimate goal here is to incorporate climate into our financial system so that we can flow capital to sustainable business practices. That's what investors want. That's what all the capital markets want, because guess what? Climate change is real and it's here, and we have to do something about it, and we have to prepare for it. I mean, we felt it when we were together in London when it was 100 degrees in every single meeting room, and we had an event on extreme heat canceled because of extreme heat. I mean, these are not jokes. These are happening now. And it's something that I think the world is waking up to. And so the financial system, which basically runs the world, is saying, oh, wow, what are we doing? How do we measure? How do we get this stuff involved into our investment decisions, all the way from development banks to individual investors? That's the goal, is so that it's not an afterthought, as you said. It's not a weird hippie thing. It's not a voluntary do-gooder thing anymore. This is mainstream global commerce.
Yeah, exactly. I also want to touch on something that people don't talk about enough, I think, but is really also very important and something that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has led in for a long time, which is project level accounting and intervention accounting. So one
Hmm.
of the standards that the GHGP has is the GHG Project Protocol. And I was actually talking to a former colleague at WRI a couple of months ago, and they said, man, I was talking to another colleague the other day, and we were really bummed because, we wrote that project protocol and we feel like nobody's really using it. And I looked at him and I said, this is the basis of the entire global carbon market, right? Like all of our methodologies, all of the things that we do to assess how well the things we're doing to mitigate emissions and reduce emissions and remove emissions are working are based on the Greenhouse Gas Project Protocol.
Hmm.
ISO also has a project protocol, the 1464-2 standard, right, that helps lay out some of those core principles. And now with the ICVCM core carbon principle label as well, like I feel like we have a much more solid foundation for how you do that basic intervention accounting broadly. I know a lot of this is being talked about in the Actions and Markets Instruments technical working group right now in the context of the GHGP update. But, we spend a lot of time rightly focused on how are we measuring emissions, how are we reporting emissions. That is obviously the first step. The second step is really digging in and saying, okay, what do we do about them? And how do we measure and assess the impact of the things that we're doing about them? And those two core functions are the basis for all of our climate regulation, right? Like those are the two things that we need to really be able to do well. But carbon markets aren't the worst. They went first, and they have not been without their controversy over the years. And so I'm curious, in the update process and as we're sort of moving through this next phase of work, the GHGP's role in helping set some of those foundational standards, like, is that part of the conversation? How are you thinking about that? And how do we really help accelerate and tap into the power markets to massively accelerate decarbonization action?
You accurately pointed out that we have all the building blocks. And in our previous discussion, we were talking about the importance of getting this right, getting it embedded into the global financial system. I think one of our biggest problems in getting there is how complicated this subject is.
Hmm.
It takes a bit
Yeah.
of time. And we're, even in this discussion, I think we're trying our best to spell out abbreviations and acronyms and failing. So, when you're talking to somebody who's like, what is this?
Yeah.
This is why my newsletter is called Sustainability Simplified. We need the decoder ring.
Hmm.
We need to be able to use examples that people can relate to, and then they'll understand the importance of what it is we're actually doing. And we can take some of these incredible intellectual property works that have been created over the years and adopted so widely, and then use those building blocks to create this system. But it's going to take a lot of understanding, a lot of work to get that kind of funding and consolidation together. One thing I will say is that having been around a zillion years, there's no pride of authorship. There's no like, we must succeed on, or, it's about getting it right. And I'll use an example of like SASB, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, was around for quite a while. And then they saw their future in the International Sustainability Standards Board, and they just merged into it. Same thing here. If we see that system developing, the one that we've just been discussing, we'll just merge into it, because what we need is that global system that works for global commerce. And all the building blocks are there. The complication can be sorted. The money needs to be coming in, because frankly, we're our own worst enemy and fracturing the market with all kinds of different stories. But there needs to be this central story. What is the infrastructure? How do we get climate embedded into global commerce? That's the story that we need to tell.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So let's fast forward 5 years from now. If you could look back and say, here's what I got done, where do you think we would be as a field, and what would make you feel like you had just been wildly successful in this role?
Yeah. So first of all, I think having a single global carbon accounting system that is recognized across the world and used for that financial system we discussed earlier. But secondly, and I think maybe more poignantly, at least for all the way back to the introduction part of this, for me, it's about decarbonization. If at the end of the day, I made measurement more precise or more accurate, I won't be happy with this job. The point of the standards, and the reason that there is such polarity and so many people are interested, and frankly, let's just say having discussions and conflicts over the standards, is that they matter. And they matter because they lead to decarbonization. There are policy decisions embedded in measurement standards that can lead to decarbonization at speed and scale. We used the product carbon footprint example earlier. It's just one example, probably the highest leverage example, but it's one example. And so, 5 years from now, I'm going to be way older than I am now. And I'll definitely be looking back and I'll be saying, if we unlock decarbonization with the work that we do in standard setting, then I'll be satisfied with this role.
Yeah, excellent. I love it. Well, Tim, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your insight and taking on this enormous but incredibly important challenge. I know there's many other places you could be choosing to spend your time. And so I think we are deeply grateful to those of you who are really willing to dig in and do the hard work to move this space forward, and looking forward to continued collaboration.
Thank you, Alexia. It's been a wonderful conversation. I've learned a lot. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. And I hope that your listeners also got something out of this. And I hope we can do it again.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's a wrap on this special episode of Navigating Net Zero. If you enjoyed the conversation, please be sure to follow or subscribe, and help us spread the word by sharing this episode with your friends or colleagues. Thank you again for listening. Until next time, take good care and keep up the fight.